Good evening. So nice. I can't actually see you, but I know you're there because I can feel you and I can feel your enormous applause that will continue as I introduce you to this incredible panel. But before, of course, I go any further, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the waters where we are tonight, the people of the Wurundjeri and the Woiwurrung. And of course, when we're thinking about big ideas, our First Nations people were the innovators with wisdom in all areas of how we should be. And we're only just now slowly cottoning on to some of that wisdom. And we need to do that, obviously, deeply as we head forward to a hopeful treaty in this state. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm really excited to be here tonight because imagine getting to hang out with Smarty Pants, the three of them over here. My name's Jacinta Parsons, by the way. This is where, when I say that, I expect also a really loud applause. Yeah. If you want to whistle at any point, you know, that's always a really effective, thank you, very good. Don't be afraid to use that whistle throughout this evening. In celebration of their 30th birthday, the Australia Institute invited some of Australia's most interesting minds who are leaders in their fields to respond to what is the big idea and to share with us a vision of what Australia might be or should be. Most of the ideas in this book are addressing inequities of housing, of access to mental health, and of our geopolitical relationships. Tonight we'll hear from three big thinkers who will join us on our stage on those issues. But I also want to find out as well from them tonight how we might harness that enormous genius of the bold and fearless ideas of people like them who sit at the coalface of these problems with viable solutions, but who are faced possibly with an unwilling or disconnected political system. So joining us on the panel, maybe will we clap? Look, I'll say the wonderful Professor Patrick McGorry, who was first on my list. Go crazy. Welcome, Professor. I just want to show deference. Former Australian of the Year, Professor Patrick McGorry has spent his career in advocating for and developing early intervention and youth mental health services. He's the Executive Director of 𝐒𝐻𝐿, Professor of Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. And he led the advocacy which resulted in the establishment by the Australian government in 2005 of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation, which in 2006 became Headspace, and he remains a patron of that organisation. Give him another round of applause. Thank you. That's a highly edited bio. We would be here all night if we went through your achievements, Patrick. On the other side over there, we've got Dr Emma Shortis, who is the Director of the Australia Institute International and Security Affairs Program. Emma, you're a historian, you're a writer, you've been focusing on the history and politics of the United States and its role in the world for a long time. And boy, oh boy, haven't you come into your special time to be alive. Emma's first book, Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States, gives a little bit of a spoiler alert on where we're going to head with this conversation. It was published back in 2021, and Emma also was a lecturer at RMIT. It feels like, I always feel like we're doing a dating show when we do this. Please welcome Dr Emma Shortis. And last but not least, and certainly not in an order that makes any sense, Maiy Azize is the national spokesperson for Everybody's Home. It's a campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis. She's also the Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia, which is a network of welfare and caring organisations linked to the Anglican Church. She's contributed research for the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, a fellow of the Australian Basic Income Lab, and Maiy is the author of 5 ideas. I read that today. Australia Needs Now and Homes for All, a roadmap to affordable housing. Please make her very welcome. Do you know what? It's just fun to come out and clap people, isn't it? Like, that's all we needed to actually achieve is like, we've got some great thinkers. Good on you. Look, I'm going to dig into each of your really incredible essays. And, you know, when we talk about incredible thinkers, you just need to look at a small smattering of who has contributed to this book to know of the incredible quality of thinking and of writing and of innovation, etc., around big ideas. But I first want to dig in with you all around this idea of big ideas. I want to ask firstly, do you think that the issue with adopting some of the extremely sensible big ideas that appear right throughout this book is because, I'm going to give you a multiple choice, you can buzz in, because as a people, we're fueled by fear and that we are frightened and it leads to individualism? Do you think that there are issues with adopting big ideas? Is it squarely an issue of government? Or, and I've got this here, dare I say, our broad neoliberal agenda that puts profit before people is why big ideas are so hard to come by. Who would like to kick us off? Maiy, you looked away from me, so you get chosen.
Well, I'll start by echoing your really beautiful acknowledgement of country. It's not lost on me whenever I talk about housing that, you know, we're talking about how to house and organise ourselves on land that's stolen. So that's an important thing to acknowledge when we talk about housing or any other social justice issue in Australia. I choose option C. One of the things that we repeatedly find in the housing debate is that the solutions that we need, the things that we need to see change so that everybody can have access to a home that they can afford, a secure home that they can afford, they're things that are widely supported by the Australian public, and they're things that actually it's the political class and occasionally the media and commentary class are really out of touch with. Poll after poll after poll in Australia shows that people want to see the government step up and provide more housing directly. And in spite of a lot of the commentary that we've seen, tax reform is also pretty popular in Australia. Guardian Essential polling that's been done a couple of times in the last 2 years, as well as Galaxy polling and polling for the 9 Fairfax newspapers, has shown that around 50% of Australians support reforming negative gearing capital gains tax concessions. There's a chunk of people who are undecided. Only about 15% of people really consistently oppose this. So it's pretty difficult to find major tax reform in Australia that's that widely supported, actually. But there's a commentary around it and a story that's told around it that implies that it's unpopular. And I think in the housing debate, as we see with so many other debates, we've got a debate that's dominated by a small section of interests that are pitted against a really large number of people who actually want housing to live in and not housing to necessarily invest in.
Thank you, guest number one, who's chosen C. We'll see if you're correct in just a moment. Patrick McGorry, what do you reckon? Is it our fear as a people? Is it our political class, or is it neoliberalism? You can choose A, B and C if you want.
I think I'd choose C as well. We've had to think about this a lot because we've seen a massive surge of mental ill health in young people over the last 20 years or so. 50% increase as we were building these new systems to respond to their main health problem. The tide was rising, and when you see that, it's only in this age group, teenagers, young adults, and they're the miners, canaries of society. And Sir Michael Marmot, spoke about this, how a society can make you sick, and something has happened to society, and it isn't just in the last 20 years, it might even be earlier on, but with a bit of a slow burn. And you mentioned neoliberalism. So we published a whole issue of the Lancet last year, the Lancet Psychiatry Journal. Is one of their commissions which is on big issues like, HIV or climate change or in this case, youth mental health. And we had to try to understand what was driving this. Obviously we've got to respond to it, and the government actually did yesterday with a huge announcement, and so did the coalition match that. So finally they have connected with what people actually want here or need. But what is driving this? So we looked at all the different forces that have been happening over the last few decades, and we call them mega trends, and things like climate change, like the housing crisis that Maiy was just talking about, but maybe they've got a common root, and is that going back to really big ideas, grand theories like in neoliberalism, which was very unpopular for decades. And then, thanks to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, it got revived in the 1970s and 80s. And it's really driven everything, on the left and right of politics. That everyone's embraced this market theory that everything's a market. And that's fragmented everything. Look at education. Even our universities have been privatised. So everything's been fragmented and turned into a commodity. And naturally, that's fed individualism and the sense of, collective. The welfare state that I grew up in is been dismantled pretty much. So it's probably no wonder that young people are showing the signs of this, because they're more vulnerable to these effects than any other age group, because they're in transition from a secure childhood to to adult life, and it's a very challenging thing for anyone to navigate. But all the headwinds and all the forces making it possible to do that successfully have been undermining them.
So interesting, and we're going to dig into both your areas again with much more kind of fine questioning around some of those historical contexts. The 70s and 80s were a real pivotal time in both areas of mental health and also in housing. But Dr Emma Shortis, which one would you like to plug in, A, B or C?
Look, I think I'm going to be compliant and choose C as well, as somebody who has spent probably too much time focused on the United States. I think neoliberalism and rampant neoliberalism, particularly of the American kind, does a lot to explain how we ended up with Donald Trump. Vast inequality, the erosion of the institutions of the state, and a population that feels deeply insecure. I think we can't necessarily understand from Australia how insecure American people feel, when you're one piece of bad luck away from complete catastrophe, from bankruptcy, you're one health issue away from bankruptcy. That deep sense of insecurity is partly what led to the rise of Trump, because it allows him space, the erosion of those institutions of the state allows him space to harvest the kind of hatred that he is so good at cultivating. And I think that's, we are seeing the consequences of that. But that rampant neoliberalism, I think, also drives the fear that you identified as well, Jacinta. Trump is so good at capitalising on that kind of fear, on fear of the other in particular, and we're seeing that playing out in the United States now with mass deportations, with the way Trump is attacking diversity, equity and inclusion, and kind of reviving the segregationist rhetoric of the civil rights era. That long history of inequality and redirecting blame from that inequality away from entrenched power, away from the rich, has been so successful in the United States. And again, we're seeing the consequences of that. But I think it's interesting as well to consider, is the era of neoliberalism over? All of these free traders who championed free trade as our economic salvation, pivoting pretty quickly and dismantling that, arguably neoliberal world order before our eyes. And it's not clear what comes next.
I want to come back around to all of you before, again, we go into detail. But going from there, when you think about, okay, are we at that kind of last gasp of neoliberalism? It is such an embedded, ideology, and it's created machinery and its infrastructure and everything that it stands for. Is there a chance that big ideas can be mobilised in any other way? Is the force of people enough for change, for example, and for the cultivation of listening to big ideas?
I mean, I think we have to believe that, don't we?
Well, tonight
the alternative is
we do.
pretty awful. But I think that, we can look to the United States for that example. The United States has an incredible ability to reinvent itself, to face extraordinary crises like the Civil War, and out of that build something quite extraordinary. And that when that has happened, it has always happened through the power of mobilisation, through social movements like the civil rights movement, through the revival and the enrichment of democracy and democratic accountability. And as much as it's hard to see that in the United States at the moment, that still exists. Those coalitions can still be built. I hope we're seeing them be built now in response to what is happening in the United States. It's a horrible mess, and what Donald Trump is doing is incredibly dangerous, Trump and his administration. But there is a response, and American democracy is not dead. You know, it can be revived, it can be revitalised, and Australia can play a role in that as well. You know, we do have, it's an imperfect democracy, but we have lots of institutions, democratic institutions, to be really proud of, and that we should be talking to the world about, like compulsory voting. You know, imagine what the United States would look like if voting was compulsory. It would be unrecognisable. You know, if American democracy had been more responsive, as Maiy was saying, to what people actually want, which in the United States is things like gun reform, addressing inequality, reproductive rights, it's a completely different country with that kind of functioning democracy, and that is entirely possible.
Do you agree, Patrick McGorry, that it's possible, as the behemoth that liberalism is, to turn that tide possibly through, you know, activation of the public and of the populace?
Well, I read a book called The Invisible Doctrine. I don't know if anyone has heard of that book, but it's written by a British journalist called George Monbiot. And the first problem is that people don't even know that neoliberalism is even there. They just think that that's the way things are.
That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about that youth cohort. They've been born into a world where we've still got a memory of what it was potentially like before markets really drove everything. That's an interesting space for them to be in also.
Yeah, they've grown up without any memory of what a welfare state really is. And so they've grown up thinking that it's okay to have private schools, for example, and have them like Taj Mahal sitting in the community, and then just down the road you've got a crumbling infrastructure of I went to state high schools. I grew up in the UK, and then I came to Australia when I was 15, and I went to state high schools in both countries, and they were much better than any private schools that even existed. And now, over that period of time, we've flipped it so that, you know, we've got a two-tiered system, and it's the same in health. The NHS is crumbling it's not crumbling in other European countries though, because they've protected their public institutions in a much better way. So I don't know. I mean, I think first of all, people have got to have their consciousness raised, and this involves community organisation. People don't just suddenly twig to what's actually going on. So if you look at the book that was written in the 1960s called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, that has to be done. That sort of process has to be done if people are going to see things clearly and be mobilised to. I've tried to do that in mental health. Get Up helped me a lot in 2010 when we were campaigning hard for mental health investment and reform. But it was just one of the things they did. So they said, well, you need to set up your own Get Up for mental health. And we have tried to do that, and it's called Australians for Mental Health. And you would think, you know, when you talk to every single person in your network, every family that has got someone with mental health problems in their family, it'd be easy to mobilise that, but it's not. It's not easy to mobilise it, and it takes organisation, and no one will fund you to do that, you know. No one. I've tried for, nearly 15 years to get donors to fund an activist organisation like that, and they won't do it. So organising and mobilising the public is necessary to do the things that Emma, I think, was talking about, really. It's not just going to happen naturally, I don't think.
Maiy, have you got anything to add to those perspectives?
Yeah, I agree with Patrick. One of the things we see again and again in housing, I was talking before about how the solutions that we need and that I go into in the chapter are very widely supported by the public. But in my work at Anglicare, that's true of a range of issues. You know, there is a large constituency for doing things like raising the rate of job seeker and other income support payments. There are large political large segments of the population that agree with huge numbers of the things that we want to do. I've got friends who work and campaign in all kinds of areas where there's broad public support for the things that they want to do. The challenge is really turning that into a political constituency. And on housing, I really believe that the way we're going to win the things that we need is not just getting people to agree, because actually we're so far along the way there. The issue is that we've got a constituency of people who invest in housing who are more powerful than the people who actually want housing to that they can afford to live in. And we need to turn those people into a political constituency, not just a cohort of people who agree.
That's so interesting. And, reading your chapter, Maiy, in this incredible book that you should buy tonight, and looking, and, I'm a kid of the 70s and the 80s, but I had no idea of the kind of statistics that you share in your piece around the history. The answers were back in the day when there was, 1 in 5 people...
1 in 3 people.
1 in 3, is this the renting statistic?
Yes.
1 in 3 people rented a home from the government.
That's right.
And then there were even more staggering. Tell us the rest of that.
Yeah, so the history of housing in Australia is interesting in many ways. It's kind of uplifting to look back at things that we used to do and be able to see that we have the answers to the problems that we now face. It's also depressing to see how far we've gone, how far backwards we've gone.
I do want to address that in a moment, but yeah.
Yes. But after the Second World War, Australia, like a lot of other countries, this wasn't unique to Australia, looked around. We had a bit of a housing affordability crisis. What are we going to do about it? And the answer in Australia and a lot of other comparable countries was for the government to start providing housing to people. That was a fairly simple solution, not groundbreaking. And it was Labor governments after the Second World War that really built public housing at the time from the ground up. And they were building about 30,000 homes per year. At the high point, about 1 in 4 new builds in Australia was being built by the government. So a really a substantial share of the market. And right up until the early 80s, about 1 in 3 people who were renting in Australia were renting from the government. And that wasn't just people at the margins, that was people like public servants, that was people like construction workers, teachers, you name it, all sorts of people used to rent homes from the government. In the 70s and 80s, we really started to see a change in how governments approached the issue, and there was a real change in the zeitgeist. Again, not unique to Australia. This was a pretty common phenomenon throughout the world. One of the things that's really interesting, we had a commission into poverty by the Whitlam government in the mid-70s, the Henderson Poverty Inquiry, led by Ronald Henderson. I work in the social services sector, and Henderson is a bit of a giant in social policy, but he's got a really mixed legacy on housing. There's a chapter in that report that basically identifies it as a problem that public housing is so poorly targeted. It was identified as a problem that about 75% of people who were living in public housing were not people who were in poverty. Many were working people. This was seen as a big problem. We started to see governments really step back. The focus started to be on, even when we were supporting people who were marginalised and couldn't afford housing in the private market, instead of providing them housing, the solution came to be giving them things like rent assistance payments to, support them in the private rental market. Today, Commonwealth rent assistance actually costs the budget 4 times as much as social housing, which is, shows you how backwards that approach is. But it is a shame, because when you look around the world at the countries that have either turned their housing crisis around or avoided it altogether, they are the countries where the government is playing a much bigger role in providing housing. They are not just leaving it to the private sector.
That historical context actually marries up with yours as well, Patrick McGorry, looking at that there were really wonderful solutions, big ideas that happened, 80s, 90s with youth mental health particularly, that were eroded in the decades that followed. Is that right?
Well, yeah, we can maybe come back to mental health in a minute, but just listening to Maiy, there are progressive economists now who, like Mariana Mazzucato, who has written a series of books basically making the case, which probably the Australia Institute is very much on board with, and I think they might have even brought it to Australia at one point. So there's a book called The Value of Everything, and it's showing how the current economic theory is only one of about 4 different ways of actually running a society in terms of the economy. And what's happened is a lot of value has been extracted from the economy by what they call rent seekers, basically. So there's a lot of problems with the way that the country is being run. So I think this is where these big ideas are really important. We need to have a different economic, and it doesn't mean necessarily getting rid of capitalism, but it's making it work for the common good. And that means reversing a lot of these ideas, having respect for government, seeing the neoliberals basically deride and try to disempower and shrink government to almost a vanishing level. We have to, she says, just rebuild that respect for the public service and for the welfare state. Really rebuild it, and that's what we have to do. Now, that is easy to typecast that in ideological left-right sort of terms, but it's what we need to do. And again, it's about the public understanding. There's no discussion, there's no debate, certainly not in election campaigns at that level, of the choices that actually we face. So mental health, I think, it's a sort of a sad story in a way. I trained in the old mental hospitals, the old asylums in the 1980s, and we thought, this is terrible. We've got a 19th century model. We've got to get rid of it. We've got to have a modern, evidence-based scientific system. So we need to be part of the health system. So what they did was they sold off all of these, closed all the asylums, and they sort of dumped the residual bits into the acute hospitals who didn't care about mental health at all. And it's just kind of languished and sort of broken over that period. They never invested in it, and it's fallen apart. That's why we had a Royal Commission in Victoria, which has changed nothing actually, which is very, very disappointing. And in New South Wales, the system's imploding as we speak. So that it's gone backwards for different reasons, perhaps, from what Maiy was describing. But we have to rebuild it. We have to rebuild it. And the government made I would say, a small step yesterday in the right direction to start doing that.
And that's part of, you mentioned before, and we probably won't use the word depressing, just, dispiriting, is that many of the big ideas, that are required now in reform have already happened. And there's less and less agency potentially for the activation of those big ideas. Any thoughts on that, Maiy?
I'm a bit conflicted about that because I think it can be exciting and motivating. My role as kind of a campaigner and a campaign spokesperson is to get people excited and motivated, and I think framing something as a big idea can be that. There's another part of me that thinks it's actually just extremely obvious. After the Second World War, the government is like, oh, there are people who can't afford housing. We should provide housing. It's not. It's like it shouldn't be complicated, and I find it incredibly frustrating when you have a lot of people writing about this issue, thinking about it, and complication is a tool of making this issue seem insurmountable,
that's very much true, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm sort of conflicted because I do think it can be positive and exciting to frame this as a big idea. I think it is. It's interesting. I think people who are progressively minded often think that society is on this linear trajectory of progress, things sort of inevitably improve. And I think the history of housing and so many other issues in Australia tell us that that's not the case. Progress is not a linear kind of line this way. But I think it's also interesting because one of the things that I find in my work and I've observed is that people who are not progressively minded. I mean, I'd be interested in your reflections on kind of right-wing politics in the US, but there are all of these actors who really see it as their role as reshaping politics. But I think progressive politics in Australia, and particularly centre-left politics in Australia, often sees their role as responding rather than shaping. I was reading a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher. I was reading a book.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. I'm going to mention her as well. I was reading a book about housing in the UK, and they reference a speech that she gave the day before she was elected. She was reflecting on the nature of social change and saying that the orthodoxies of the past, can become I suppose, inevitabilities in the future. And I think the idea that housing should be a core responsibility of government has been something that's been obvious in the past, and it can become an orthodoxy again. It can change again.
Yes, that's hopeful. Patrick, you want to say something during that?
When Maiy said things are obvious, that's so true. In mental health, it's exactly true. It's obvious what needs to happen, absolutely obvious. But because of neoliberalism, what you have, you've had the system fragmented into all these vested interests. So, when Mark Butler holds a symposium, for the sector at the beginning of becoming the health minister, there are 80 different, people in the room, all with their own little sectional interests, because it's been split into so many different pieces. And so what is obvious is not possible because people won't agree because of their conflicts of interest. So that's a massive problem. And to try to transcend that and deliver what is actually necessary and obvious is very, very difficult in those circumstances. And even if you have a breakthrough, it'll be undermined by those vested interests if you're not careful.
And obviously, America is a really interesting case study, current, happening right now. This is your moment to shine, Emma. In terms of that winding back, sort of concepts that Maiy mentioned before around, progress is not a linear line. No. Tell us what your thoughts are in terms of, big ideas and obvious solutions that get hampered deeply through this.
Well, I think that's part of the reason Trump's so successful, isn't it? Because he says things in a really straightforward way. He identifies problems really clearly and offers really straightforward solutions. I think it's really important to say he's not actually trying to fix problems. He's trying to create them. But what progressives or, broadly speaking, the left, which is a kind of different conception of the left when you're talking about the United States, has fallen into the trap that Maiy identified of, just believing that you have to explain things in great detail, in really technocratic detail, which kind of just erases those big ideas and the idea of possibility and of imagining a different future. And so what you have as a result is Trump, the kind of consummate retail politician, identifying people's problems, making them feel heard, making them feel, justified in their worries about their future and about their children's future. And then on the other side, you have a Harris campaign that's talking about really technocratic economic policies about particular aspects of price gouging that she's going to address in her next administration, but actually things are mostly fine. The Biden administration did some really good things and she wasn't going to distance herself from that. And that fell flat. Of course that fell flat because people didn't believe it because it wasn't true. It didn't match with their material reality. But still, Democrats in particular have this idea that, if they just put the words in the right order, they just explain things properly, people will realise Trump is bad and we can go back to the way things were. But that loss of ambition, I think, is what is hampering the Democrats so much and why people like Bernie Sanders or AOC have got such appeal, because they do talk about big ideas and they do say things like, it's actually not that complicated. Provide housing to people who need it. It's fairly straightforward and people support it.
It's a shock, isn't it, when you think of a country of how many bazillion people that we haven't yet worked out how to communicate effectively big ideas that have a simplicity to them that everybody can... It's not about undermining complexity, it's about communication through it all. It's a really interesting time for you, is an understatement of the century. But also, we were reflecting backstage about what you think. I mean, the piece that you've written is a really interesting one, and Tucker Carlson started it for you, which is quite... Was that a gasp?
I know, sorry.
Someone gasped in the audience. Yes, that's what was the motivating moment for you. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So, as part of my role, I have to pay a bit of attention, unfortunately, to what the right wing in the United States is doing. And some of you might remember that Tucker Carlson actually came out to Australia before the election, and the Australian right wing did their kind of suitable fawning. But there was a particular moment where Carlson kind of pointed out that Australian foreign and security policy is based on this idea that the United States is always coming to save us. If we ever need them, they'll provide us with our security guarantee, and that's why we have to always be so close to the United States, because we need them, we need their protection. And Carlson just straight up said, that's wrong, you guys. You can't rely on us. We're not coming to save you. And it's not often that you agree with someone like Tucker Carlson, but he's right on this. And, I think that's always been true. The United States was never going to come to our rescue unless it was in the United States' interests. And Trump is just revealing that truth in a way that makes it undeniable.
It's interesting that this piece was written before his election, but, obviously the last couple of days, last couple of weeks, and his relationship with, the countries of the world, and Australia particularly, of course, has really undermined this mateship narrative that has been ongoing for such a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Trump is telling us, he's been telling us who he is for a long time. It's just now we actually have to listen and pay attention. But the way Trump is treating allies, not just Australia, but across the world, Ukraine is a clear example, is appalling. And it's being met with that kind of horror in the United States as well. But this is Trump telling us, what his version of America is. And I think it's important to say it's not isolationist and it's not anti-war. The idea is basically stomping all over everything. And I think there's a real sense in Australia of exactly what Trump is doing. We had our Prime Minister say in the debate just the other night that he's not going to link what Trump is doing with tariffs, his attacks on Australia's free trade agreement with the United States, to security or to the AUKUS deal or to the ANZUS security alliance. But I think Australians intuitively know that you can't do that. You can't draw dividing lines between economics and security. Economic security is actually part of security as well. And, if Trump sees no value in Australia's free trade agreement with the United States, why would we think he sees any value in the AUKUS submarine deal or in the ANZUS treaty? Of course he doesn't. And I think this is a real moment, a huge moment for Australia, one that comes so rarely, for us to really rethink our relationship with the United States and our role in the world more broadly, and what it would actually look like to think about our security and our safety differently.
Do you think they are? Do you think they are thinking about that seriously or not?
In the government?
Yeah.
I think there is, within the Labor Party certainly, there is big concern about the AUKUS submarine deal in particular, and a recognition of what Trump is doing in dismantling the rules-based order, because Australia has a long-standing commitment to international law that Trump is trashing. And I think that, they know that he's going to keep doing that it's only going to get worse. But I think what is really interesting about this moment is that there has been this locked-in bipartisan consensus about the US alliance. The Labor Party supported the AUKUS deal within a couple of hours because of that compulsion for consensus. That seems to be shifting, and shifting really quickly, partly because of a shifting political landscape in Australia, where independents are now starting to talk about Australia's role in the world in a way that they just haven't before, and partly because the coalition is being kind of torn apart by its adherence to Trump ideologically, but its inability to say that, because saying that means we put America first, and of course you can't say that in Australia. And so they're torn now about what to do about the alliance. And so I think the political ground is shifting really quickly, and this groundswell of opposition to AUKUS, of opposition to what Trump is doing, is going to put some really interesting pressure on Australian foreign policy.
I'm interested in reflecting on that as as something we're watching so closely, and it's so enormous for us in our lives right now. Obviously, we've got an election coming. I'd be interested not to speak politically, but just to talk about this time and what the opportunities are, I suppose, which is really important. Do you think, Maiy, am I being naive? Probably. That this does provide the opportunity for that reflection? When you describe housing as it was, and our communal and society responsibility to housing in the way that it is through the government, having been eroded, do you think this does actually provide an opportunity for us to think about it differently when we're seeing the erosion of certain, pillars happening elsewhere?
It's an opportunity for the country, but I think the thing that's perhaps underappreciated is that it's also a huge opportunity for a party that's brave enough and interested enough to seize the moment on housing. People are really hungry for something big. I was thinking, as Emma was speaking, about, the Harris campaign's, talking points around price gouging, and I'm reminded of how the government trots out a bunch of talking points about their Housing Australia Future Fund and the Help to Buy scheme and all these things whenever anyone talks about the housing crisis. I don't want to get too bogged down in detail about those things, but none of them are things that cost the budget money. They're actually all off-budget measures, and they only help very tiny numbers of people. They're not things that are designed to make housing affordable writ large. If they did that, it could provide them with such an incredible legacy, and it could be so amazingly popular. I think it baffles me. It baffles me that parties aren't interested in giving the public what they want. This idea that there's a concern and we can just answer it with some talking points is something I've always found really perplexing. But I think this tendency that that the current government and its preceding its predecessors, I guess, Labor leadership, their inability to kind of seize on these issues. It was reminding me, and I was reminded a few times when Patrick was speaking about the UK, actually. I had a look at some research a couple of years ago about welfare in the UK, the welfare state in the UK. I defer to your greater expertise on this, having lived in the UK. There's a political scientist in the UK called Tom O'Grady who took a look at attacks on the welfare state in the 80s and 90s, and he wanted to understand kind of public support for the welfare state. When did it change? And he looked at the British Social Attitudes Survey, and he compared it to speeches in Hansard. And one of the things that he found is that public opinion on the welfare state in the UK didn't actually change until the mid-90s. So there were attacks under Conservative governments, but they were actually pretty unpopular. They weren't well received by the public. And it wasn't until Labor changed the way that it talked about welfare that the public changed its mind. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we need to take on board, because when we accept an orthodoxy as inevitable and we treat that as our starting point in how we communicate and the things that we ask for, as I think the Labor Party has on housing in Australia and many other progressive actors have on housing, it limits us, but it also strengthens that orthodoxy.
Well, that's true, though. I mean, Labor have delivered neoliberalism in Australia too. It was Hawke and Keating that did that, and they covered it up with the social contract with the unions, and then that could be stripped away later by coalition governments. So it's the same with Blair, as you just said. I mean, I've read that too, that it didn't really bite until the 90s, and Blair, was the midwife, basically. So I think that's exactly right. And now we've got both major parties that still believe in market theory, and they still privatise stuff. They still put everything out to competitive tender. So the Commonwealth dollars that go out into mental health, it's only $4 billion a year the Commonwealth spends on mental health, $42 billion on NDIS for about a tenth of the people. So massive asymmetry in what they're doing here. But even the money they do put out, they deliver it in 1,000 pieces, because it is this competitive tendering process, which is based on this market theory. There's a market. It shouldn't be a market. It should be planned and delivered according to the sort of principles that you've been talking about.
Patrick, for you, looking at this, election year, is there hope for you at all that we might see, sooner rather than later shifts?
Great time to ask me this, because I stood next to the Prime Minister yesterday in Ashfield.
Did you? Big. Look at
he
you.
announced $1 billion for the next phase of building a youth mental health system, mainly, is what it was about, which is because the onset of mental illness is mostly in young people, and if you want to impact on it, it's a paradigm shift. You build the system around that stage of illness, and so they made a very significant, even though it wasn't huge, it was like $1 billion over 4 years, but and as I say, $42 billion into the NDIS, so it's not huge, but it's significant, and it's well designed. And the coalition announced it a week earlier, almost the same thing, probably not quite as much money, but the same. So we've convinced them about the paradigm. So I am feeling much more positive about the federal government. State governments, on the other hand, they've given up on mental health. I think they will never do much outside the front door of the hospital, because hospitals are their focus. And the big proposition when you closed all those thousands of beds for mental illness back in the 90s, the proposition was we would build strong community mental health services at the state government level, and they have not done that. So everyone who's seriously ill ends up in the emergency department and gets mistreated by emergency department staff.
It's a really cheery conversation. And what we're about to do is open it up to you to ask cheery questions. No depressing questions are allowed. No, go for it. We're going to put your hand up in a moment. And I guess just a really quick kind of final word from each of you. And Emma, again, you know, what a time to be Emma Short, you know, like Shortis, to be doing the work that you do. Let's not tell the truth too much about how bad it's going to be. But again, the question is, you know, if we're framing this around big ideas, what will the impact of America and what we're seeing there and our relationship with America, as it's been so, you know, firm for so long, what do you see in terms of that relationship to big ideas?
Look, you know, I think, as I was saying before, Jacinta, I think we have a real opportunity. You know, what Trump is doing is so bad and so dangerous for Americans and for the rest of the world that I think he's revealing some truths about Australia and Australia's role in the world, you know, that we can choose to face and choose to address. You know, we're not powerless, and recognising that could be really revitalising, I think, for Australian politics. We're the 13th biggest economy in the world. Like, we have actually a lot of power and a lot of diplomatic heft that we can choose to use, but we have to make that choice. And I think that's where I find hope in what is, you know, an exceedingly depressing time looking at American politics. You know, at the Australia Institute, we surveyed Australians about how they feel about the Trump administration and the alliance before the tariffs, before the Zelensky meeting. And more Australians said that, given the choice, they would prefer a more independent foreign policy over a closer alliance with the United States. And that's a pretty radical shift when you consider the history of Australia's faith in the United States. And in that lies an opportunity, I think, to do that rethinking about our role in the world and what actually makes us safer. And that is things like housing, equitable housing and mental health support and general health support, action on climate change, for example. So there is that opportunity, and I think there's a huge appetite for it here in Australia. And I would also just say as well that our polling also suggests that there isn't a huge constituency for Trumpism and the kind of things that Trump is doing here in Australia. And the strength of our democratic institutions has an awful lot to do with that.
Even though I can't be editorial, you left us with some really good news there. Thank you. Patrick, you know, the opportunity, I suppose, is the question that we're leaving on. What do you think the opportunity is? That we're in this state, we're in this space right now, we've got some great ideas. What is our opportunity?
Well, maybe what Emma was saying, that you know, sometimes when the world is turned upside down, that's probably the only way you're going to get a quantum leap, you know, and a rethink on the fundamentals. So maybe Trump's doing us all a favour by what's happening.
Please write that. If you're a journalist, that's what Professor Patrick McGorry just said.
Don't say I said that.
Wonderful. And Maiy?
Yeah. Well, a short reflection from me. I think that looking back on the past and our history with housing in Australia, the extent to which the government used to support and provide housing in Australia, even things like limits on rent increases. It's a huge debate now, but we actually had limits on rent increases in many of our states up until the 70s in Australia. Everything that we have ever had to do to fix housing in Australia has been done in this country before. The only difference is that we are now a richer country than we've ever been, and that makes me feel hopeful.
Wow, I'm glad you found hope somehow in that bit there. But there is enormous hope, and I suppose we rely deeply on the big thinkers and the leaders and, you know, innovation and looking back at the past and bringing it forward for us for any hope that I guess we have for the living in this world as we wish to do. What's the big idea? You need to buy it today. I'm just telling you that. Please, before you get to ask questions, let's first clap them for that moment there. Patrick, Maiy and Emma. And if you've got a question, we've got microphones finding their way around. So there's hand shot up the back right away. He's ready to go.
Thank you very much for a fascinating dialogue. It's been really fascinating, I think, for all of us to hear. You focused enormously on neoliberalism and the contraction of the role of government in society. It seems to me that government has two broad functions, to oversimplify. One is security, external and domestic. The other is to intermediate between different competing vested interests in society. Neoliberalism has attacked the role of government, has developed a narrative that government is inherently inefficient and it needs to be privatised as far as possible, which has led to the whole dialogue around the role of government being negative and derogatory. Public servants are not public servants, they're bureaucrats. Government is ipso facto inefficient. Seems to me if we're going to change the way the country is directed, we need to reassess the role of government and develop a narrative which actually brings out the positives in what it can do. The old saying that government is ipso facto inefficient is no more true than that the private sector is automatically efficient. We've seen that in many places.
Yep.
I'd like to hear your views on what we can do to rebuild faith in the role of government in providing a more progressive approach to our social problems.
Yeah, go Patrick.
Yeah, I think that summarised exactly what I got out of reading these progressive economists like Mariana Mazzucato. That's exactly what she says. You know, we have to rebuild the credibility of the state. And her first book was called The Entrepreneurial State, and she makes the arguments that most of the advances, the big advances that people have profited from in the private sector have come out of state investments, whether it was in NIH, in healthcare in the US, or the development of the internet. All these things have been, all the breakthroughs have actually come from within government, from within the state. So, and she goes a lot further then over the series of next series of books. And she talks about, one of her books was called Mission Economy, where you define what, and I think the Labour government in Britain had 5 missions when they were elected based on that thinking. So she's been very influential on the centre-left side of politics, I think, and even the Treasurer has been influenced by her ideas too. So she's one. Joseph Stiglitz, who the Australian Institute brought out a couple of times to Australia, another one. So you have to have intellectual heft and power behind these paradigms to rebuild the credibility of that perspective. And it's very much in tune with what Maiy was saying about rebuilding the past, but in a better way, with a lot more wealth in the society. And it's not trying to kill off the private sector either. It's trying to get the synergy, the correct balance, which I've only seen that in Western Europe, in countries like Scandinavia, where that's been optimised really.
Either of you like to make a comment on that?
I think we need to communicate about these issues in a way that recognises that the public agrees with us. I think one of the things that's really odd is that these are all very, I agree with everything that you said in your question, and these are all things that are widely supported. Proposals that are on the table at the moment to axe 40,000 public servants are actually pretty unpopular. Again, poll after poll shows that it's really unpopular. Emma's colleague at the Australian Institute, Greg Jericho, says all the time that the most popular thing you could ever put on the table for Australians is nationalise insert industry. People support government in Australia. Australians support this. The right has not succeeded in persuading average people, but they have succeeded in co-opting, I think, the political class, the media class, and persuading everybody that their ideas are default. That doesn't mean that they're popular, and it's a bit bizarre that we've all accepted a consensus that so few people actually support.
Great.
Interesting, the media at the press conference yesterday with the Prime Minister, once they got off the topic of mental health, which they covered really well, every single question was a negative question about recession, the economy, how come you're spending all this money? The media completely coming from a sort of a market economy type perspective. The media are not balanced in the way they think about these things. They're not properly educated even, I don't think.
Unless it's spending on defence, that's fine. Spend as much as you like.
Yeah.
Anything from you, Emma, or we go to another question? Another question? Don't play with your hair down the back because we're coming for you with a microphone. There we go.
A comment earlier was that the inhibitor to big ideas was ambition. Politics has become a team sport. Little ambition on either side. I'd be interested in your thoughts about making it a time limitation on the ability for people to sit in Parliament. Maybe for 10-year compulsory time. If you're there for 10 years, you haven't achieved anything significant, out.
Wow.
I think that that would encourage people to be more ambitious and hence bigger ideas.
Emma, do you want to kick off on that?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump's busy trying to undo that in the United States at the moment, isn't he? And take away term limits. Look, I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea, and the question of ambition is a really important one, and that's part of what the book is about, is, you know, reviving ambition in Australia, because we have done huge things that have led the world, like the minimum wage, like Medicare, like providing housing, and we can do that again. But that ambition, I think you're right, has been dampened particularly by a kind of two-party system that treats politics as that kind of team sport. But I think it's entirely possible that that is changing. You know, when you look at the role of independence and community movements, for example, and how they are shaking up Australian politics and have been for quite some time, you know, I think there's real scope for that to change. And, you know, I think if we look to the United States as well, there is real space for political ambition, and people are starting to recognise that. You know, you just have to look at Senator Cory Booker, you know, breaking the record for standing up in the Senate. Like, that kind of political ambition, there is an appetite for that. And so I think, you know, we can have some hope that it's coming.
Great. Another question?
Me? Okay.
Oh,
sorry. I was just thinking, we've been very Australian-centric, but America has sort of left the stage internationally, USAID, World Health. It seems... I'm wondering if there's some way of inspiring us and giving us a mission, not just within Australia, but externally. And I'm also wondering what you think about the relationship with China and what impact it'll have on us in the future, where that should go.
Yeah. I think there's a huge opportunity for Australia to step up, particularly in our immediate region. You know, Australia, especially recently, has been a pretty bad faith actor in the Pacific in particular, where we'll have governments go to the Pacific and talk about, you know, our Pacific family and standing shoulder to shoulder, and then, you know, they'll come back home, turn around and open a new gas field or a new coal mine. There's a real opportunity to rebuild those relationships and act in good faith and act on things that really concern the Pacific in particular, like climate change as a genuine security threat. And I think the withdrawal of the United States, the abrupt and ungenerous and cruel withdrawal of USAID, and the role of particularly health support from the United States, is a huge opportunity for Australia. And we are a rich country. We can do that, you know, without any loss to ourselves. Like, imagine what we could do with the $368 billion that we're supposed to be spending on submarines that we don't need and we're not going to get. We could have a huge impact in our region. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily frame it as, you know, as a competition with China or necessarily opening up a space for China. I think we underestimate what we can do with our diplomatic ability and in building those relationships and making that relationship with China in particular a productive and fruitful one. But that involves recognising that our interests are not the same as the United States when it comes to China.
great. I don't look. You don't have to touch on China, Maiy, if housing is not intersecting so deeply with that. Maybe one more question.
I did think about it as a joke. Just
One more question before we finish for tonight, and we sell some of these wonderful books.
Hi. We work in the homelessness sector, and something that we're finding is thinking about how we can change people's perception from thinking of housing as a wealth generator. And, you know, I don't think it's anybody's fault that we have considered housing this way. You know, we were all encouraged to for such a long time. But how do we move that social structure away from thinking about housing as a way to generate wealth and for people to get ahead to something that is a human right and that everybody needs. What can we do to encourage our friends and family to think about that differently?
I think that one's for me. I'm going to push back a bit on the premise of the question in two ways. I think, firstly, I would say it is someone's fault. It is the government's fault that we. Okay, this is. I really encourage people not to say things like "we as a society." This is a top-down phenomenon. There was no demand from the general public that we introduce a capital gains tax discount. There was no demand from the general public for the Baroque investment arrangements that we have in Australia that are extremely unique to Australia and New Zealand, actually, around the world. It's true that around the world, housing has been come to be viewed as a wealth generator, but there are many aspects of that are unique to Australia that have been imposed on people by the government, and that is where the responsibility sits. And I also don't agree that people need to chip in as individuals. I feel like people are operating within a system. I actually just had a media inquiry today from a journalist who was asking what advice I would give to seniors about how to navigate the rental market, and I kind of turned it around and said, this is putting the onus of onto individuals to navigate this crisis that is entirely created by government. I think the thing that we can all do is put the onus back on government. One of the tools that they use is to talk about the housing crisis as though it's this weather event, it's this external thing that's happening, it's not something that they have created. This is a crisis that has been entirely created by government. Only government can fix it. Individuals can't fix it.
Such a good point. Yeah. Well, I think that kind of finds us to the end of a bloody delightful evening. I want to do this all the time, just hang out with my new friends. Could you please give a huge round of applause for Professor Patrick McGorry, Dr Emma Shortis, and Maiy Azize. Is that right? Kind of. Now, these three scallywags will head down to the back of the room, so if you just want a little signature or something in your book, or like neoliberalism, love heart, Patrick McGorry or something, you can request it down there. But we thank you so much. This is what is so important. We come out on an autumn night and we listen and we think and we talk to each other about some of the ways that we can see a different world. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.